Thank you so much. Today, we're going to be starting with an introduction to dairy workers, followed by federal protections, a discussion on personal protective equipment or PPE, state protections, resources for remedy, including workers' comp and OSHA complaints, and we'll follow it with a discussion. Next slide, please. By the end of the session, we hope that you'll understand federal health and safety protections for dairy workers and employer obligations. We hope you'll have resources to share with organization staff and dairy workers. And we hope you'll share strategies to inform dairy workers about their rights and protections. Next slide, please. The reason we're focusing on dairy workers today is because they face a unique set of circumstances that result in a high risk of contracting H5N1 or bird flu, and they have few legal and regulatory protections. They're often not protected by many of the laws that apply to other agricultural workers, such as H2A regulations or the Agricultural Workers Protection Act, or APA. They have less routine oversight, which can compound worker vulnerability. For example, the lack of routine housing inspections creates precarious housing situations. Working with cows creates a constant risk of injury, and intense work hours and on-call hours during calving seasons can create extreme mental and physical stress.
So we're going to talk about regulations that apply and don't apply to dairy workers. Um, what I want you to think about is that many of you here are outreach workers and people who work with farm workers directly, as does our program. And so when you visit farm worker housing, there are rules and protections for workers, but through oversight or lack thereof, uh, and the exemptions for the kinds of housing that farm workers or dairy workers are in, you might be the first person visiting the housing or the dairy worker in quite some time. So OSHA has a small farm cutout that the rules still apply if there is a temporary labor camp. But there's a gray area of what a temporary labor camp is. As many of you realize, dairy work is oftentimes not season dependent, or at least not traditionally season dependent, and people are at their jobs for some time. And so there are potentially temporary labor camps that would fall within the definition, but oftentimes in states with regulatory authorities, it has a self-certification loop where the employer needs to request certification in order to get certification. Obviously, there are risks of avoiding that, but we find oftentimes that when we visit dairy workers, that we do meet folks who've not had direct oversight from state authorities. And whether a temporary labor camp falls within the OSHA regulations is a question of law. In fact, how long have they been there? Do they still have family residing somewhere else? Do they return to see them often? Where is their intent for where they're living? But those are case dependent, and we're going to talk to you more broadly about this. But part of talking about the risks and the protections is so that you all can be equipped to talk to workers and talk to dairy workers about the protections that apply to them, as well as the resources that may apply to them. For example, in the state of Michigan, mental health counseling is available to certain agricultural workers free of charge upon application. And we hear from dairy workers, as Rebecca mentioned, that uh, being on call, the long work hours, especially during calving season, can be a toll. Um, so as we go into this, just think that uh, if you're visiting folks, you might be the first person to have visited in quite some time. Next slide.
So H5N1 is a type of avian flu or bird flu, and it's a viral infection that causes respiratory symptoms. There are two main ways to contract H5N1. One is working with animals that may have bird flu, and two is working with materials like raw milk that are contaminated with bird flu. Dairy workers are at a higher risk than other populations for contracting H5N1 because they work closely with cows, which can transmit, the virus to humans. Cows spread the virus through milk, spit, feces, and other bodily fluids. Um, of the 70 confirmed cases in the US, 41 were exposed to H5N1 through dairy herds, and there's only been one confirmed death in the US. As of yesterday, 1,049 dairy herds across 17 states have been affected by H5N1. Next slide, please. As outreach workers, you've likely received resources on avian flu, so I'm not going to elaborate a lot here. This slide will be included in your reference materials. But in some, bird flu can have a spectrum of mild to severe cases. They can last a few days to a few weeks, and there's still uncertainty of how the flu is caused and transmitted. Bird flu in humans can be treated with antiviral medication, but the US is not currently offering vaccines for H5N1. Next slide, please. Under federal rules and regulations, dairy workers have the right to receive training on workplace safety and health in a language understandable by the worker. They have the right to operate safe machinery. They have the right to receive required safety equipment, including PPE. They have the right to report an injury, illness, or illegal practice without retaliation. These rights are guaranteed under the Occupational Safety and Health Act and enforced by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. Next slide, please. There's no specific OSHA standard covering avian flu, but there are some OSHA standards that can be applicable to certain aspects of controlling exposure to the flu, which we'll talk about more when we get to PPE. Note that OSHA standards only apply to farms with 11 or more employees or farms with temporary labor camps. OSHA generally cannot inspect farms with 10 or fewer employees, which is a majority of dairy farms. But some state protections cover farms with 10 or fewer employees. Pass to Dorian.
Yeah, so you see a couple of provisions here listed that Rail could protect dairy workers as they are continuing to be subject to exposure to bird flu. The first is the general duty clause. So this is a catch-all provision where a more specific regulation doesn't apply, but we've seen it used. We've seen it recently used in recent years. There's not a specific heat safety rule, for example, and we've seen federal OSHA sanction employers where folks got seriously injured or unfortunately passed away from heat. And as Rebecca mentioned, with bird flu, unfortunately, we're dealing with potential for serious injury or death. And that's where the general duty clause comes in. And so to trigger the general duty clause, you need to assess whether there is a recognized hazard. That's going to be a question of law and fact, but many states are already taking education attempts and further protections regarding bird flu and the risks thereof. Did the employer fail to keep the job site safe from a recognized hazard? And did the hazard cause a serious injury or death? And so if you're answering yes to those questions, then you may have a complaint under the general duty clause. Also, the field sanitation standards exist to protect harvest workers and agricultural workers. And some of the basic protections there are that workers should be provided cool, safe drinking water. They should be provided with restrooms, and they should be provided with hand washing stations. They also should be allowed to have reasonable opportunity to use these things. And so bird flu could potentially create additional complications for this. If you're suiting up in PPE and you're sequestering yourself in a particular dairy barn with check-in and check-out areas, which we'll talk more about later, then do you still have access to the drinking fountain that's maybe not located in the dairy barn? Do you still have opportunity to use the restroom when you need to use the restroom? We've had people report to us even before bird flu became a serious issue that dairy workers had sometimes time constraints, whether it was direct or indirect. They just had too many things to do in the day to meaningfully hydrate, to meaningfully be able to use the restroom, and meaningfully be able to clean up when they felt like they needed to most. And so these additional requirements to be safe with bird flu are going to potentially compound these issues for dairy workers who are already stressed as it is. Next slide, please.
Oh, I'm just going to jump in real quick. There are a
Mhm.
couple other sanitation rules that include that employers must provide clean personal service rooms, such as lunchrooms or break rooms. And if PPE is provided or required, employers must also provide changing rooms to prevent cross-contamination with employees' clothing. And also, one more thing, if there are no medical clinics nearby, the employer must provide first aid supplies. Next slide, please. The CDC created non-mandatory guidance for employers to reduce exposure to avian flu for people working with animals. These recommendations are based on whether workers have a medium, low, or high exposure level. Dairy workers should be considered to have a high exposure level, particularly because they come into contact with raw milk, udders, and other animal secretions. For high exposure workplaces, employers must implement three types of controls: engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. Um, Engineering controls are those which reduce or prevent hazards from coming into contact with workers. This includes things like ventilation systems or milking systems with automatic features. Administrative controls are those that establish work practices that reduce the duration, the frequency, or the intensity of exposure to hazards. This would be things like monitoring animals for illness and educating workers so they can monitor themselves for illness. And then finally, we have PPE, which we'll expand on in a little bit. Since this is a recommendation and not a legal requirement, workers don't have the right to receive this information in their native language. Next slide, please. Thank you. OSHA recommends that employers should implement and train workers on the previous CDC protocols for protection from H5N1. If an employer is required to provide PPE under OSHA regulations, the employer is also required to pay for it. The cost of PPE cannot be deducted from a worker's pay. So under OSHA, the use of gloves, eye and face protection, and respiratory protection might be required. Workers can bring their own respirators as long as the employer determines it's not a hazard. The time taking PPE on and off, which is also called donning and doffing, should count as working hours, and the employer, again, should be providing this PPE free of charge. Next slide, please. For workers in high exposure situations like dairy workers, the CDC recommends a particular set of PPE, including a NIOSH approved particulate respirator, fluid resistant coveralls, safety goggles, boots, covers and boots, a head or hair cover, disposable gloves, and a few optional items, including a waterproof apron over the top of coveralls to prevent cross-contamination during PPE removal, a face shield over the top of goggles, and a respirator to protect against large amounts of liquid splashing onto your filtering respirator, and outer work gloves to protect disposable work gloves. Again, it's not required for employers to provide this, it's only recommended. Next slide, please. No state has an actual mandate for requiring PPE for all workers who are at risk of exposure to H5N1. In California, which has heightened protections, employers must provide PPE if H5N1 is detected on their farm. Again, not just a risk, but an actual detection. Dairies and organizations that serve at-risk workers can request a one-time supply of PPE from the California government. Some states are actively distributing PPE to dairy workers, and some states require an employer to request PPE. Some of the states with like forms that you can fill out to get PPE include California, Colorado, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Some states require that you contact your local public health office. This includes Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, Wyoming. This is not a total list, but this is what I was able to find. Several states are not accepting PPE requests at this moment, although they may have previous to this moment, and that includes North Carolina, Ohio, and Oklahoma. Many states don't actually track the distribution of PPE, so we don't have a lot of information about who it's gone to and whether it's gone anywhere. Dorian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just we've had reports of dairy work sites where PPE is distributed, but not everyone has the same access to the same amounts of PPE. And so as outreach workers and folks who talk to uh, farm workers and dairy workers regularly. That's something to think about, and to talk to them about. Did they have access to it? And we also see a gap of the ability of dairy workers to request PPE directly from the state. A lack of a mechanism. Oftentimes, it's between the employer and the state, or the state's sort of planned rollout of PPE and follow-up. And the stuff, especially as this virus sticks with us, you're going to see degradation of PP. Stuff's going to break down. And so how do people get new equipment when there's uh, fails or rips or what have you? So these are things to talk to workers about. And do they have proper storage? Are they able to keep this stuff safe and separate from their the rest of their clothes, the rest of where they spend their time? Next slide, please. So dairy worker housing oftentimes falls within a gray area where the general oversight of farm worker housing just doesn't happen for dairy housing. Whether it's a state interpretation of their own health codes where there are too few folks working at a dairy barn, or um, the lack of seasonality where it doesn't appear to be a temporary labor camp because people can work for longer than a season or even into years at the same dairy barn. That isn't to say that many dairy housing sites are already within the scheme of particular state enforcement, but they can fall outside of it. And so we have seen severely degraded housing in the dairy world with exposed asbestos, with a lead paint. And so these are things, if you are doing outreach to dairy workers, to think about and be prepared for. And um, and even if the housing is not degraded, there are certain vulnerabilities to dairy housing. Oftentimes, the housing is located very close, if not adjacent, to the dairy barn itself, raising concerns about cross-contamination and proper separation between where folks are living and sleeping and working and being exposed to bird flu. And there are protections. So even though the normal scheme may or may not include the particular dairy housing that you're going out to reach, the states oftentimes have basic habitability laws and tort laws for exposure to unsafe housing. So those are there, and those are things that you want to equip yourself with the knowledge of in your particular state of what protections do apply to dairy workers. And even if the normal inspection process doesn't happen, does this particular camp have rules that should apply to it? So these are things to think about, and also to think about how this can compound other safety issues for dairy workers. So, for example, here in Michigan, one of the housing rules talks about having access to laundry. And without that rule being directly applied to a dairy worker, how do you make sure that they have the same access to, to, to clean clothes, clean bedding that everyone else should enjoy? And how do you compel that? And so some of the spin out of not being with a normal regulatory scheme can impact some of the basic things that we take for granted as far as keeping ourselves safe and healthy, and things that dairy workers especially are going to become more and more sensitive to as they continue to be exposed to such a hazard as bird flu. Next slide, please.
So many states do have protections that go beyond OSHA's protections. In some, this includes the ability to inspect farms and dairies with less than 10 employees, which federally OSHA cannot do. In California, Washington, and Oregon, for example, inspectors can investigate dairies and farms of any size, and they require an employer to contact them if any injury requires a worker to be hospitalized overnight. And whether the farm provides worker housing is irrelevant, unlike the national standard with temporary labor camps. California has several bird flu specific policies. For example, employers must provide PPE if H5N1 is detected on the farm. Employers must provide workers' compensation benefits for workers that get bird flu on the job. If you work in a quarantined area, your employer must provide you with regular medical checkups. California must also provide employees paid sick leave, uh, which is up to 40 hours or 5 days, whichever is more, in a 12-month period. I'm passing on to Dorian.
Yeah, so we're going to talk more about sick leave in a bit. Wanted to, at this point, talk about an example of a state regulation regarding combating bird flu here in Michigan. So the Department of Agriculture here in Michigan issued an executive order with certain policies and protections for dairy sites and other work sites that might be exposed to bird flu. Um, and the executive order had a few examples that I just wanted to share so for other people can see how at least the state of Michigan has looked to combat and protect workers and protect from the spread of bird flu. So the executive order called for a few things. It called for an employer to designate a biosecurity manager to manage the policies and procedures for the executive order. It also called for a line of separation, is what they called it. Basically, an actual taped off line to keep the entry points to just a couple of spots where people could log in and log out and not enter the dairy barn from other spots. And so basically a controlled entrance and exit and a logbook where people could only enter or exit from those spots. And if you entered or exited from those spots, you're supposed to have ample opportunity to disinfect and put on or take off PPE. And it got very specific. It talked about using a foot bath to be able to spray down and hand sanitizer and hand washing right at these separation points, the line of separation. And again, line of separation should be visibly marked. This isn't an imaginary line. It should have been clearly marked, and the access points also should have been clearly marked. So this likely could have helped many workers and can help many workers, but there's still some other considerations to think about as far as, in this example, regarding dairy worker health. So, for example, storage. Where are folks supposed to keep their PPE? Where are they taking it home with them and potentially exposing it to other belongings in their home, or do they have a locker? Do they have a place to put it right there at the job site to prevent cross-contamination? Are they given proper education on how to use this stuff? I mean, some of this stuff they might be familiar with, but as Rebecca shared, there's a lot of new equipment being introduced all the time. Are they given an opportunity to be able to learn how to use these items that they might not have had to use before? And some just basic things. So if you're working within a line of separation, where do you have lunch? Is there a safe place for you to have a meal where you're not exposed, where you can take off your PPE and not be exposed to contaminants such as the raw milk? And what are the privacy concerns? If you're working entirely within a controlled area with supervision and you're logging in and logging out, and your housing is potentially adjacent or near this area that is heavily surveilled and tracked, what potential individual privacy and civil rights concerns might arise from such an environment? So these are things to think about when we talk to dairy workers who are having to deal with all this stuff. Next slide, please.
Under OSHA, employers do have a few obligations towards their employees. This includes conducting hazard assessments, providing PPE, and providing training on how to use it, training workers on CDC protocols for protections. They're theoretically supposed to do this, but they're not actually legally required to, and they have to follow additional state protections if possible. Next slide, please. Workers' compensation is a employer insurance that gives employees benefits if they suffer a work-related injury or illness. Workers' comp can cover medical expenses, wages from lost work time, and travel expenses. States are divided as to whether agricultural workers should be protected by workers' comp. Some states mandate coverage for farm workers, and others exempt agricultural employers from providing workers' comp. Dairy workers are generally considered agricultural farm workers, so they might be exempt from coverage. Nonetheless, some employers get workers' comp even if not required by law, so it's worth checking to see if the employer at issue has it. States will often look to the nature of work in determining whether an activity constitutes farm work that would exempt one from workers' comp requirements. Dairy workers are usually exempt when their job responsibilities are closely linked to the expected activities of a farm, such as feeding cattle and milking or caring for cows. An employer may be penalized if they refuse to rehire a worker on the basis that they filed a workers' comp claim. I do have an example from Wisconsin of how worker compensation can function on the state level. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip it, but if anybody's interested, it will be in your materials. Um, if your injury or illness leads to a permanent disability, there are other types of benefits you can qualify for. And in the event that workers' compensation is not an option, a worker can sue other options such as property liability insurance. They could file a civil suit such as a tort claim, but it's best to consult an attorney and go to your local legal aid center to determine the best course of action for a worker's personal situation. If we could have the next slide, please. Here we have Farmworker Justice's map of workers' compensation by state. The blue states indicate full coverage, meaning state law requires employers to cover agricultural workers. The purple states indicate limited coverage, where the state law limits coverage requirements to only certain agricultural employers or agricultural workers. And the red indicates optional coverage, where the state does not require any coverage for agricultural workers, but employees can elect to provide coverage. Next slide, please.
So OSHA has protections where against employers retaliating against workers for speaking up about worker safety issues or complaints. So for employers, they cannot seek to fire or demote or deduct pay from workers in retaliation for raising issues regarding worker safety. So the kinds of protected actions that should not be retaliated against are communicating directly to managers and managerial staff about health matters, actually reporting a work injury or illness, filing a worker safety complaint with OSHA, or participating in an OSHA inspection. And so if a worker is retaliated against, terminated, demoted, had their pay deducted, or moved to another less desirous area of the job site, then they potentially have a retaliation complaint that they can file directly with OSHA. And while this is prohibited, we know that this stuff does happen sometimes, and that's why this mechanism exists. It's a very short deadline. So 30 days to file a retaliation complaint, typically with OSHA, where generally a work or safety complaint, you have typically 6 months. So it's a much shorter deadline. And so if the retaliation happens, the workers or their advocates need to work quickly to let OSHA know about that. And there may be other whistleblower statutes available in addition to just the OSHA whistleblower. In your particular state, there might be other civil rights or employment or public policy whistleblower complaints that are available that might also have similar or different timelines as well, depending on what exactly happened that triggered all this. Next slide.
So it can be a little confusing to know which complaint to file, a safety and health or a worker or a whistleblower complaint. So if you want to report unsafe and unhealthy conditions, you file a safety and health complaint. But if you're going to report retaliations or threats for raising that health or safety concern, you file a whistleblower complaint. You can file a safety and health claim anonymously, but not a whistleblower complaint. Here's some other information that Dorian has already covered. And to reiterate, the whistleblower complaint must be filed within 30 days of the threat or retaliation. But there are other whistleblower complaints under OSHA and other laws that can be filed up to 6 months after the retaliation. The complaint form for safety and health and whistleblower complaints under this statute are pretty short, and they'll basically just ask you to describe the hazardous detail in as condition in as much detail as possible. Next slide, please.
So filing a OSHA complaint is usually a rather simple process. There's typically an online form. Michigan's in a state-run plan, and so there are 22 states and Puerto Rico have their own state-run plans where they have to at least meet the federal standards, but they can go above and beyond. They can curtail exactly the process for some of these mechanisms, such as the complaint process. And so in Michigan, they have their own online form, which is guided. It takes you through how the information they're looking for to allow you to file. And it can be filed either directly by the worker or by a representative. And the worker safety complaint can be filed anonymously, or they can actually leave their information for further follow-up. Retaliation complaints, or sometimes called discrimination complaints, cannot be filed anonymous most often. So again, you should have about 6 months from the date of the incident to file the complaint. And after it's filed, typically an investigator is assigned, and they more or less try to work independently, at least in my experience. There might be some follow-up directly with the person who filed the complaint, if there are particular details that they need to know. But generally, they are trying to go and find independent witnesses and view the work site, him or herself. Um, I've seen investigators go to the work site that day. So oftentimes they work quickly if it is something that in the complaint shows a real concern for worker safety. They can make it an exigent circumstance and actually go there that day to actually take in their own facts. The investigation, it varies on how much time it could take and how many witnesses they want to interview and how much additional fact finding, how much they want to hear from the employer as well. And ultimately, they'll issue either a corrective notice or a citation that could come with fees that need to be paid to the state or potentially directly to workers. And this ultimate result should it be reported back to you as the complainant or the representative of the complainant, but it might not, and the entire investigation and its documents very well might not be provided to you. So Freedom of Information Act procedures vary by office to office and by state to state, but you might need to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get all the documents from the investigation and see the ultimate results and ultimately what led to that result and the different tests that took place and what they were able to confirm or not confirm during their investigation. Next slide.
So the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act that we're talking about next only applies to employers with 50 or more employees. So this is not going to apply to many dairy workers. However, if it does, it allows workers to take up to 12 work weeks or 3 months of unpaid leave per year for a qualified reason. Qualified reasons include a serious health condition that makes the employee unable to perform the essential functions of their job, or caring for a spouse, son, daughter, or parent who has a serious health condition. When an employee requests FMLA leave due to their own serious health condition or a covered family member's serious health condition, The employer might require certification in support of that leave from a healthcare provider. An employer might also require a second or third medical opinion at the employer's expense and periodic recertification of a serious health condition. There should be no discrimination, retaliation, interference, etc., with an employee's ability to use FMLA. States may have their own paid leave laws, and these state level laws might vary. They might depend on the size of the employer. They might be paid or unpaid depending on the size of the employer and our net income of the business. For example, in New York, employers must provide paid sick leave if they have 5 or more employees, and unpaid sick leave if they have less than 5 employees and less than 1 million in income per year. Dorian has more information on state level paid leave laws.
Yeah, just wanted to share the Michigan law that was recently enacted this year called the Earned Sick Time Leave Act. And this also does not have an explicit carve out for small farms or agricultural workers. It does require someone to be in a job for 4 months to be able to utilize uh, paid time off, but uh, people start to accrue it right away. And for dairy workers, they could begin earning this time and use it after 4 months of being on the job site. And so it provides not just for the paid time off itself, but also has an anti-retaliation provision here in the Michigan law, which we have heard not just within bird flu, but generally with agriculture workers, um, a fear of taking time off, whether they whether it's they think they'll be fired right there and then, or they think that they won't be able to get the appropriate medical treatment or invited back for a future season. Uh, Time and time again, we've heard folks that are very nervous about actually taking time off, and so potentially having this anti-retaliation provision will allow folks to have some peace of mind that they can, while they're being exposed to potentially being sick at work, they could hopefully not have to worry about being fired for actually taking time off to actually get better so they can return to work safely. But this is something for all of you to think about. What other protections exist in your state and are available for dairy workers where you're actually working? And and then what is the best way for you to talk to workers about the rights available to them and the protections available to them so that they can utilize these rights and protections. Next slide, please.
So we're not actually going to talk about medical legal partnerships today, but I will let you know that we have a webinar on them in a couple months, and you will all receive information about that webinar. I'm eager to get to our discussion portion, so I'm skipping this. Next slide, please. Here's our contact information in case you want to reach either Dorian or myself with our emails up there. And again, we can share them in the chat later on if anybody is unable to find this information.